So good afternoon, everyone. I think this talk follows very nicely from the last panel. I think you'll see how these relate to one another. So the title is Protecting the Unprotected, Do the Compacts Provide a Path? And much of the discussion over the last 2 days has been fairly technical EU asylum policy, details on policy and proposals and implementation strategies. And I want to take the opportunity in this concluding keynote to step back a bit, take a more global and conceptual examination of the international protection regime for forced migrants. So I want you to let your minds expand a bit here, and I also hope to take your minds off some very unhappy developments in the EU, such as the deeply disturbing announcement of the UK Prime Minister yesterday. So I'm director of the Zolberg Institute, and the institute was named for Ari Zolberg, who was a noted academic in the US who wrote about the history and practice of refugee protection, about American immigration history, comparative EU and US policies, many other topics. Brussels was Ari Zolberg's home. As a young Jewish boy during World War II, he watched the Germans march into Brussels, and he was hidden in the outskirts of Brussels by a Catholic family and converted to Catholicism while he was there. He and his mother survived the war and came to the United States. He didn't speak a word of English. His father was on the last train out of Brussels to the death camps. Now, of course, this was the time of the birth of the modern international refugee regime. He was there at the beginning. It was a new agency, a new convention, a pretty capacious definition. It was intended to aid all the victims of persecution, and through practice over the years has protected tens of millions of people around the world over the past 7 decades. But as we've seen in this conference, despite the creation of this document in Geneva, in Europe, the system, the refugee protection system, has come to be less about protection and more about security and border enforcement, including externalization policies. And I should add here, I've heard the term remote control several times over the last 2 days. That was a phrase coined by Zolberg. That was his phrase. So there's much to be said about the failings of the convention system, and much has been said here about that, and possible routes for reform, and what role the compacts might play in that. But what I want to talk about today is, even if we were to make that system run perfectly, be more fit for purpose, I think we'd still need to recognize the shortcomings today of the concept of the system as a whole, put in place, as I said, almost 3/4 of a century ago. And I'll say it very simply. The vast majority of people protected by, let me say it this way, sorry, the vast majority of forced migrants in the world are not protected by the international refugee regime. It's because they didn't cross an international border, or because they're not in the definition of people within the convention definition, or it's because states don't apply the convention when they could. And recent situations are making this more and more clear. So I think here of the temporary protection afforded to Afghan parolees, the phrase is parolees in the United States, now also for Cubans and Nicaraguans and Haitians. Similar protection for Ukrainians in the US. The invocation for the first time of the temporary protection directive in the EU for Ukrainians. The case of 6 million Venezuelans who have crossed borders, who don't obviously come within the definition, the convention definition. And perhaps most obvious to all now are climate migrants, either because they don't cross an international border, most will remain IDPs, or even for those who do cross, like Somali drought victims. They're not going to fit into the definition unless they show some other ground of persecution. I could also add to that in the Western Hemisphere, the flow from Central America, mixed migratory flow of people fleeing corrupt states or gang violence or climate change there as well, where putting their claims into a strict convention claim might be quite difficult. Now, we could simply try to fix this within the system, add a new protocol to the convention. We could widen the mandate of UNHCR. Other fixes are possible. But I think something broader and deeper is needed. I think what we need is a paradigm shift here. And that's what I will argue in my comments today. I don't think we see that shift in the GCR. I agree with those who spoke earlier today saying that maybe we see a glimpse in the GCM. Now, I'm using the word paradigm shift, phrase paradigm shift. It's well used, perhaps it's overused as a phrase. It derives from Thomas Kuhn's book written in the mid-20th century called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn, talking about scientific revolutions, described what he called periods of normal science, where there was an understanding, a consensus about grounding assumptions of a particular discipline. They're accepted, progress is made through experimentation, further development within that paradigm. But then anomalies begin to show up. The existing paradigm can be played with, it can be manipulated, it can be modified to explain the anomalies, but ultimately it comes to be replaced by a new paradigm in science with a different set of core assumptions, different premises that may build on the past. Progress may happen, but these new assumptions describe a different world, a different way of approaching the phenomenon that need to be explained and understood. So that progress occurs not through a straight line in science, but rather by the shifting of these paradigms that takes us to new understandings. Now, in our world of study and practice, in forced migration, here I'll be talking primarily about forced migration, not voluntary migration. The dominant paradigm is the refugee paradigm. It means the non-return of persons forced across borders due to persecution on one of the 5 particular grounds with which you're all familiar. But we're beginning to notice some anomalies. The groups that I just mentioned, for example. That is, there are lots of groups to whom we think protection should be extended that don't really fit the models. Now, there have been attempts to bring them in. So, first of all, Civil War victims who may not be individually targeted are now pretty well accepted as refugees. When the Syrians left Syria for Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, everyone considered them refugees, even if they couldn't show they were particularly persecuted. So the system can grow. IDPs, well, people say, well, maybe they're going to become refugees, so maybe we should sort of embrace them in the refugee system. And UNHCR participates in the cluster system underneath OCHA's leadership, and, et cetera. Climate, well, UNHCR has issued some guidelines as to why some folks fleeing climate might be considered refugees if they could show some other ground of possible persecution. Or maybe you could use the OAU Convention or the Cartagena Declaration to reach it. Temporary protection, well, at the end of the temporary protection in the EU, the Ukrainians will be able to apply for asylum if they haven't gotten some other status along the way. So you can kind of fit these all within somehow around the refugee system. But I think the exceptions are getting bigger and bigger. And plainly, as I've said, the non-refugee forced migrants dramatically now outnumber the convention refugees. People have talked about this for a while, right? Alexander Betts has written about survival migration, which is a way to expand the category. I've written with Leah Zamor a concept we call fleers of necessity, people who may not fit the definition but feel it's untenable to stay where they are for fears to their life and other interests. I think the question for the PROTECT project here is whether the compacts recognize that new world, whether they can be vehicles for ushering in a new paradigm. So let me say a few words about GCR and GCM and then get to my proposal. You know, when the GCR started, initially, UNHCR hoped that it would lead to a global responsibility sharing system. That was one of the initial ideas. It dropped out pretty quickly. We ended up with something very different. There were early drafts that included a global platform on displacement, but that was not adopted in the end. And as has been said repeatedly here, there's hardly anything new in the GCR, and what is there fits well within the existing paradigm, right? Assistance to hosting states, promoting self-reliance, solutions, involve the development agencies. That's all within our understanding of the broader refugee world. There's nothing about access. There's nothing about accountability, enforcement of rights in the GCR, expansion of protected classes, and climate change, which could have been there if we had considered the GCR a compact on forced migration, probably belonged there. Because UNHCR didn't want it and states didn't want it there, it got pushed into the GCM, and that's why you have the overlap that was described in the previous panel of some of the forced migrants being in the GCR and many of them also being in the GCM. The focus in the GCR on alternate pathways and the role of development agencies is important, but to me it just really follows from the major failing of the refugee system, which are these long-standing, protracted situations that Madeline Garlick spoke about. Because we can't solve these long-standing solutions, we now look for other ways out. Can we bring development in so refugees can be given livelihoods? Can we find other paths through labor or through family reunification, something like that? But basically, my argument is the GCR fits well within the reigning refugee paradigm. The GCM, I think, as was noted in the last panel, I think pushes us beyond the refugee paradigm, or at least has a way of moving beyond the refugee paradigm. First of all is this attention to the root causes of flight and causes beyond conflict. So here, objective 2 is to minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin. And then under that objective, paragraph 18 talks about creating the conducive political, economic, social, environmental conditions, basically to help people stay home, right? So they don't have to flee. It says to do that, so it will ensure that desperation and deteriorating environments do not compel people to seek a livelihood elsewhere through regular migration. Now, again, you can put it in terms of it's trying to forestall irregular migration, or you can say maybe we're recognizing that additional people need to be protected. In that statement, there is no mention of persecution. There's no mention of the famous nexus grounds, right? You have to show persecution based on race, religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an important shift, this focus on root causes and different kinds of causes that need to be recognized. Secondly, in the GCM, there's a recognition of the need to address and directly provide solutions for displacement due to disasters and climate change. And again, here the idea is creating conditions for people to stay home. Obviously through mitigation efforts, which are kind of outside, reducing CO2 emissions, which are pretty much outside the convention, but through disaster risk reduction, through adaptation, through reducing vulnerabilities. That's what this term about we need to create economic and political and social conditions that help people stay home. That's really a way to say that we want to reduce the vulnerabilities that mean when climate change comes, people are going to want to leave if they can maybe perhaps adapt and stay where they are. And also Objective 5 was mentioned in the last session as well, that enhancing opportunities for regular migration. There's explicit mention of the need to address people displaced by disasters, and this is under paragraph H, where states should cooperate to identify, et cetera, solutions for migrants compelled to leave their countries due to slow onset natural disasters, climate change, environmental degradation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have an expansion explicitly in the GCM rating climate. Thirdly, the GCM also embraces extending assistance and protection to those forced to flee, irrespective of whether they fit into the definition. So in paragraph 2, humanitarian assistance should be provided to people affected by disasters wherever they are, which could mean in their home state, it could mean while in flight, it could mean while in a country of destination. Now, again, you could read this all as within the existing paradigm, so the language about root causes is really the polite face of saying we're going to contain people in the countries they are by giving them a little bit more. And of course, the development efforts of the EU are often criticized for these ways, that they're not really about development, they're about stopping flows of people. So they're really more enforcement measures than they are development measures. But I want to adopt a different reading here. I want to say that the GCM, maybe unintentionally, gestured toward a new paradigm because these anomalies of IDPs and climate and others were just too big to fit into the existing system. So let me talk for a few minutes about what that new paradigm would look like. Because if I'm really talking about a new paradigm, I need a new What are the underlying assumptions? What makes it different from what we have? To me, the central focus of the new paradigm would simply be the fact of forced displacement. Just displacement itself, not flight from persecution for a particular reason. The foundational concept of the refugee paradigm is that protection is needed because of this. There's been a sundering of the state-citizen bond, right? The sacred relationship of states to citizens. States are created to watch out over citizens, to take care of them. And when states break that bond and basically declare their citizens to be pariahs who they don't want to take care of, then the international community should step in. That's the foundational concept of refugee protection. But in contrast to this sort of metaphorical or metaphysical picture, I guess, I would consider the actual breaking of bonds of community, of culture, of family that's caused by displacement. That the decision to leave one's home is not taken lightly. And the harms accompanying flight, we know, are deep, they're scarring, they're well recognized. Loss of home and community, interruption of livelihoods and education, separation of families, increase in gender-based violence, impacts on health, lives in limbo. And these harms occur whether a person is fleeing targeted violence or escaping drought, fire, or flood. So from this perspective, it's not the reasons for flight that establish the basis of the claim to protection, but rather the fact of flight itself. Now, I think that view, which of course is quite different than the refugee perspective, sort of already has a home in the displacement canon. So I think about the guiding principles on international migration. These were drafted 4 decades after the refugee conventions, when notions of human rights suggested a reworking of understandings of state sovereignty a little bit. And they adopted a definition of internal displacement that referenced but didn't depend on causes of flight. So let me just quote for you the definition and the principles. For the purpose of these principles, internally displaced people are persons or groups of persons who've been forced or obliged to leave their home, etc., just forced or obliged to leave their homes or places of habitual residence. And it says, in particular, as a result of or in order to avoid armed conflict, generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. So they're mentioned as reasons people may leave, but the definition of a person protected by the principles are simply someone who's been forced from their home. There's no requirement of persecution, targeting, simply displacement. The obvious strength of a displacement focus is that it extends to the cases that are problematic under the refugee regime. It would cover IDPs, right? Even conflict IDPs are not covered by the Refugee Convention. It would cover people fleeing climate. It would cover the Venezuelans forced thinking that their life was now intolerable at home. Now, if the core of the refugee system is the right to non-return, the right of non-refoulement, because you can't return someone to a state that will persecute you, the core of a regime that focuses on a right on displacement is a right not to be displaced. That's the guiding principle I would talk about here as grounding this new paradigm. This is not yet recognized as a human right, although you can look through bunches of documents and statements that hint at this. It's not in a convention as such, but you can find a little bit. So I mentioned the guiding principles, or the Kampala Convention, which includes the explicit statement that state parties shall refrain from, prohibit, and prevent arbitrary displacement of populations. We're getting close there, right? The New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants commits states to addressing the drivers that create or exacerbate large movements, specifically by analyzing and responding, and here's the quote, to the factors including in countries of origin which lead or contribute to large movements. Migration should be a choice, not a necessity. So again, no express recognition of a right not to be displaced, but it's getting there. Now, a right not to be displaced has to be complemented by a right to flee, because here the problem, and this may be a much bigger problem for climate than the actual people who flee, or the people who are unable to flee, the involuntarily immobile, people who climate change has affected, has impoverished them in a way that makes it impossible for them to flee. And so if you're going to talk about a right to not to be displaced, then it probably needs to be accompanied by this right to flee for people who would flee and exercise their right, who would exercise their right to move if they had the ability to do so. So another element of this new displacement paradigm, I would think, would be a demand for accountability. If there is a right, then duties should follow. Now think about this in the refugee paradigm. It's really peculiar in a way, because the rights you have as a refugee are rights you assert against the hosting state, right? The state that took you in. Those are your rights under the convention. They can't return you. They've got to give you a right to education and protection under welfare laws and all the rights in the convention. There's a wonderful list of rights in the 1951 convention. But they're rights you hold against the hosting state, not against the persecutor, not against the person who forced you out. And there's very little in the refugee system ever about going after the people who cause the displacement. But let's think about this in the context of climate-induced migration. And here I rely on a concept of climate justice, which I think could be a motivating norm here. Justice names a wrong, displacement, and a perpetrator, those who've contributed to CO2 emissions that have caused the emissions. And then it would demand remedies. So in the climate context, the justice claim seems pretty clear because why? Well recognized, the harms are being imposed upon the people who have done the least, if anything, to cause the problem. And it's also enhanced by looking through the lens of racial justice. The cause of harm, industrialism, global capitalism, was built in part on a racial colonialism several hundred years ago. And now the impacts of the harm caused by that system fall primarily on non-white populations in the global south. So the justice claim here would be that we need to do something about this, otherwise we are continuing a global racial hierarchy. So what does justice demand for those who've been displaced or at risk of being displaced by climate change? I'd say three things. And here I'm relying on phrases that are well known in the climate world, in the various climate documents, the duty to avert, minimize, and address the impacts of climate change. But I would say avert, minimize, and address climate migration. So it would have at least, first, three things. Perpetrators should stop contributing to harming people. That is, they have a duty to mitigate, they reduce their CO2 emissions to avert flight and involuntary mobility. Secondly, measures should be taken to assist those in the process of being harmed. So this would be assistance for people forced to flee. It would also mean adaptation measures that would help people to stay home. And thirdly, there should be remedies for past harms. And this is where loss and damage comes in, this very important part of the COP27 decision just a few months ago, that there'll now be a way to think about loss. The phrase is loss and damage in the climate world, or as others have said, reparations for the harms imposed. I would also add a fourth to these typical three, and that is we shouldn't impose the cost of averting harm on those who've already been harmed. But achieving this kind of accountability isn't easy. I know that. But there have already been scores of lawsuits around the world on a range of topics to force states to mitigate, to adapt, to the rights of future generations have been raised in human rights claims to loss and damage. And they've been brought in a range of forums, local domestic courts and human rights fora and the like. So this, I could see accountability developing. But it's absent in the refugee system. We don't have any of this in the refugee system on the accountability side, which would seem to me to be a very core aspect of justice. So let me put these elements together and then compare them with the refugee paradigm. The refugee paradigm talks about cross-border movement, persecution, and the central rights are rights in the hosting state, including the right not to be returned. There's no talk about accountability, little attention to root causes. It can't handle IDPs, climate, or Venezuelans easily. Venezuelans in quotes, meaning other groups like Venezuelans. This new paradigm, a displacement paradigm, wouldn't require cross-border movement. It wouldn't require a persecution requirement. The central rights are the rights not to be displaced and the right to flee, and justice or rights claims run to the perpetrators, not to the rescuers, which is what happens under the refugee regime. it can handle these new cases I've been describing here. Now, this is not just an expansion of the old model. It's actually a shift away from the post-World War II paradigm of protection against persecution. It would represent a paradigm shift. Lots needs to be worked out. What are the institutions? What are the norms? How do you bring this down to earth? I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm not even sure I have the arguments. What I'm arguing for is this conceptual shift that will then produce the new kind of normal science where we'll be talking about how do we make these rights come forward, and basically how do we extend protection to these other groups that now fall out entirely outside the system. Now, I know you're sitting there saying, this is radical, it's unfeasible in today's world, we're barely holding on to what we have here, and you're talking about something much bigger and expansive. It's politically unwise, because once you start talking about new rights, that's even going to be harder to hold on to the rights we have, because people will see what's coming down the road. I really support and salute the work of the advocates, the academics, and the international organizations that have been here. Look, I'm among you. This is what I've been doing for the last 30 years, is working on those fields. I've just come to recognize that we can't just keep working within the existing system. We need to start work on this new paradigm, because we know what's coming. Tens of millions of people will be displaced who will be fully outside the refugee system. We can ignore them or try to fit them in some way, or we can start the task, as people did in the middle of the 20th century, in constructing a paradigm that includes them. So I think we need to think about the compacts, not just in terms about how they can firm up and improve the existing system, but how they can point us towards something new. And that working out of a new paradigm will take time, but I think we need to begin the conceptual work now. We see the needs to protect new categories, and we have the seeds in the GCM. Can we germinate them and grow a new, more inclusive garden of protection? Thank you.